Atlas Shrugged. In 1957, a 1,168-page book by Ayn Rand, called Atlas Shrugged, was published. According to one source, Rand was alleged to be a mistress to Philippe Rothschild, who instructed her to write the book in order to show that through the raising of oil prices, then destroying the oil fields and shutting down the coal mines, the Illuminati would take over the world. It also related how they would blow up grain mills, derail trains, bankrupt and destroy their own companies, till they had destroyed the economy of the entire world. And yet, they would be so wealthy, that it would not substantially affect their vast holdings. The novel is about a man who stops the motor of the world, of what happens when the men of the mind, the intellectuals of the world, the originators and innovators in every line of industry go on strike. When the men of creative ability in every profession, in protest against regulation, quit and disappear. If we are to believe that the book represents the Illuminati's plans for the future, then the following excerpts may provide some insight to the mentality of the elitists who are preparing us for one world government. One of the characters, Francisco d'Inconia, a copper industrialist and heir to a great fortune, the first to join the strike, says, "I am destroying d'Inconia copper, consciously, deliberately, by plan and by my own hand. I have to plan it carefully and work as hard as if I were producing a fortune in order not to let them notice it and stop me, in order not to let them seize the mines until it is too late. I shall destroy every last bit of it and every last penny of my fortune and every ounce of copper that could feed the looters. I shall not leave it as I found it, I shall leave it as Sebastian d'Inconia found it, then let them try to exist without him or me." A bit later, d'Inconia says, "We produce the wealth of the world but we let our enemies write its moral code." Still later, he says, "We'll survive without it. They want T. Dagny Taggart, the main character of the book, is the head of the Taggart Transcontinental Railroad. Her goal was to find out who John Galt was. She discovered that he was a young inventor with the 20th Century Motor Company, who said he would put an end to the regulations which bound a man to his job indefinitely. Before disappearing, he said, 'I will stop the motor of the world.'" He told her, "Dagny, we who've been called materialists, we're the only ones who know how little value or meaning there is in material objects. We're the ones who create their value and meaning. We can afford to give them up. We are the soul, of which railroads, copper mines, steel mines, and oil wells are the body, and they are living entities that beat day and night, like our hearts, in the sacred function of supporting human life, but only so long as they remain our body, only so long as they remain the expression, the reward and the property of achievement. Without us, they are corpses and their sole product is poison, not wealth or food, the poison of disintegration that turns men into hordes of scavengers. You do not have to depend on any material possessions, they depend on you, you create them, you own the one and only tool of production. Leave them the carcass of that railroad, leave them all the rusted nails and rotted ties and gutted engines, but don't leave them your mind." Later in the book, Galt says, "And the same will be happening in every other industry, wherever machines are used, the machines which they thought could replace our minds. Plane crashes, oil tank explosions, blast furnace breakouts, high-tension wire electrocutions, subway cavanes, and trestle collapses, they'll see them all. The very machines that made their life so safe will now make it a continuous peril. You know that the cities will be hit worst of all. The cities were made by the railroads and will go with them. When the rails are cut, the city of New York will starve in 2 days. That's all the supply of food it's got. It's fed by a continent 3,000 miles long. How will they carry food to New York? By directive and ox cart? But first, before it happens, they'll go through the whole of the agony, through the shrinking, the shortages, the hunger riots, the stampeding violence in the midst of the growing stillness. They'll lose the airplanes first, then their automobiles, then their trucks, then their horse carts. Their factories will stop, then their furnaces and their radios, then their electric light system will go. Francisco d'Inconia, who blew up all the copper mines in the world, said of Galt, he had quit the 20th century. He was living in a garret in a slum neighborhood. He stepped to the window and pointed at the skyscrapers of the city. He said that we had to extinguish the lights of the world, and when we would see the lights of New York go out, we would know that our job was done. Galt led the men of the mind, on strike, and they retired to a self-supporting valley, where a character, Midas Mulligan, says that the world is falling apart so fast that it will soon be starving. But we will be able to support ourselves in this valley. Galt said, "There is only one kind of men who have never been on strike in human history. The men who have carried the world on their shoulders, have kept it alive, have endured torture as soul payment. Well, their turn has come. Let the world discover who they are, what they do and what happens when they refuse to function. This is the strike of the men of the mind." The book describes what resulted from the strike. But years later, when we saw the lights going out, one after another, in the great factories that had stood like mountains for generations, when we saw the gates closing and the conveyor belts turning still, when we saw the roads growing empty and the streams of cars draining off, when it began to look as if some silent power were stopping the generators of the world and the world was crumbling quietly. And the culmination of their efforts, the plane was above the peaks of the skyscrapers when suddenly, with the abruptness of a shudder, as if the ground had parted to engulf it, the city had disappeared from the face of the earth. It took them a moment to realize that the panic had reached the power stations and the lights of New York had gone out. The men of the mind had taken over the world. Ayn Rand, author of Atlas Shrugged, which was a bestseller, had previously written We the Living, 1936, The Fountainhead, 1943, which became a 1949 movie starring Gary Cooper as an architect willing to blow up his own work, rather than see it perverted by public housing bureaucrats, and Anthem, 1946. She later wrote for The New Intellectual, 1961, Capitalism, The Unknown Ideal, 1966, and The New Left, The Anti-Industrial Revolution, 1970. She also published a monthly journal, with Nathaniel Branden, a psychological theorist, called The Objectivist. Rand based her novel on her philosophy, which she calls Objectivism. As she puts it, we are the radicals for capitalism, because it is the only system geared to the life of a rational being. The method of capitalism's destruction rests on never letting the world discover what it is that is being destroyed. She also said about the book, I trust that no one will tell me that men such as I write about don't exist. That this book has been written and published is proof that they do. In the book Capitalism, The Unknown Ideal, in a chapter titled Is Atlas Shrugging, she wrote that the purpose of this book is to prevent itself from being prophetic. She also quoted several news stories which seemed to indicate that the world was indeed being depleted of its brains and intellectuals. Is Atlas Shrugged a coded blueprint for the Illuminati's plans of bringing this world to a point where they can institute a one-world government? It certainly is thought-provoking, and it is included only for the sake of conjecture, being that the Illuminati is destroying our economy, and they do control the corporate structure of the United States, if not the world. There just may be something to this book, and maybe we should consider it a warning.